Hello and welcome to another episode of the Smart Freight Center Academy podcast, where we share interesting and important information and updates about freight decarbonization and the drive towards a zero emissions logistics industry. My name is Andy Golding. I'm the head of Academy here at Smart Freight Center, or SFC, as you'll hear us call it, and I'm your host for today. Today, we're addressing misconceptions in emissions accounting. And to do this, I've got my colleague, Marcus Lomax, here with me. Marcus is a technical manager at SFC and one of the most knowledgeable people that I know when it comes to emissions accounting, the GLEC Framework, and ISO 14083. So, let's dive in. Marcus, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the flattering introduction.
My pleasure. Marcus, we know that accurate emissions accounting is so important on the journey towards decarbonization for all of us, the entire freight and logistics industry. How are some of the misconceptions in this space getting in the way of accurate emissions accounting?
Well, thank you for that question. So we've noticed that the topic of emission accounting is garnering greater support and interest from a variety of different actors within the industry. And there's often a desire to go as granular as possible. But in a sense, as a freight buyer, as a cargo owner, sometimes you're buying into a more system view. So sometimes we want to cultivate a more system view approach to emission accounting and decarbonizing, because we are not the only actors along a physical supply chain. And that also sometimes reflects in emission accounting. I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail about that later on.
Marcus, what about TOCs, or transport operating categories? Why do they matter so much in emissions calculations?
Thank you very much for that question. I always think it's useful to revisit some key concepts. So, as transport service providers or cargo owners, we're required to report emission and activity data of transport chains. Transport chains are made up of discrete transport chain elements. And so let's think of transport chains as what links a consignor to a consignee. So a cargo owner moving a piece of cargo from the manufacturing plant to the end customer. And so within that transport chain, you have a variety of different modes. So let's think of a transport chain made up of a global chain of vessel movements, vehicle movements, transshipment activities. And each of these transport chain elements is assigned what we can call an emission profile. And that emission profile is established at the transport operation category level. So the emission intensity value that you use calculate the emissions of individual transport chain elements that you then sum up to calculate the emissions of your overall transport chain is defined at the transport operation category level. That's why the transport operation category is very important when going about calculating emissions.
Thank you. And okay, you've mentioned data a few times. You've also earlier mentioned data granularity. Another misconception that we often hear about is that more granular data always means better accuracy. I can see from your face as I say that you want to say a few things about that.
Sure. I think it's a very important question to ask. So we're always trying to calculate emissions as accurately as possible. And I think that's something to strive for. And I think it's great that people are going about that exercise. So as I previously mentioned, the transport operation category is where the emission intensity value is established. And it is often important to talk about how we define that transport operation category level. So it can think of it as things that have an impact on the emission intensity value. So this can be obviously besides the transport mode in question, it's also things that have an impact on, let's say, the relative fuel consumption. So the vehicle type, the vehicle size, the fuel type used, load factors, empty running factors, all these different kind of things. But typically when people think of emissions, they always think of the emissions happening at the most disaggregated level, meaning what's happening on the individual truck, on the individual trip level. And sometimes it might be more interesting or more ISO compliant, in fact, to go one level of aggregation higher, meaning looking at not just the individual trip of an individual truck, but for example, multiple trips happening for a certain vehicle over a certain reporting period.
Multiple trips happening for a certain vehicle over a certain reporting period. So what I'm hearing is maybe companies sometimes it may pay for companies to take a different perspective, take a different view of their emissions. And is this where we would talk about the aggregation and how does aggregation levels impact emission reporting?
Absolutely. So we can define the transport operation category as being an individual vehicle or vessel on an individual trip, but it can also be an individual vehicle or vessel over multiple schedules, or even a fleet of vehicles or vessels over multiple schedules. And so when we want to establish an emission intensity value, we want to establish an emission intensity value that takes into account the loaded trips and the empty trips over a certain reporting period, because we want to cultivate a sort of round trip logic when accounting for emissions. And so one of the pitfalls of, let's say, defining the TOC on an individual truck, individual trip level is that it might be difficult to account for empty running, for example. So defining the TOC on a slightly larger time scale, so on a slightly larger level of aggregation, means that you more easily count for empty trips and therefore follow the ISO logic of establishing an emission intensity value, at least on a round trip logic basis.
As somebody who's not a logistics expert myself, that makes a lot of sense to me, because what you're saying is by zooming out a little bit more by not looking at this from such a micro level and zooming out a little bit more, it actually helps us get a more complete view of the full operations of a specific vehicle or specific fleet, because we risk missing empty runs, etc. But to follow up, what is a good or a relevant way that companies can choose the right level of aggregation?
I'd, for example, like to take maybe a couple of examples to illustrate a little bit. So if you want to be, let's say, look at a more microscopic level, but you still want to be ISO compliant, is, for example, looking at an individual full truckload movement by taking into account the movement from A to B and from B to A. So taking into account the head haul and the back haul. And so then you have a closed loop, right? So you are certain that you're taking into account a round trip logic, and you're certain that you take into account any potential empty movements. Additionally, another example would be looking at a milk run or a collection and delivery round. So you look at the movements from a delivery vehicle from the moment it leaves the depot in the morning until it comes back to the depot in the evening. That is a good way of ensuring that you take into account all the fuel consumption occurring over that reporting period defined over a day. And you are certain that you take into account empty movements that may occur over that day, essentially. And so that is a good way of going into the weeds while also respecting ISO 14083 round trip logic.
Super. Thank you so much, Marcus. Coming to the last question as we start to round out, and here I really want to leave the listener with something practical and actionable. What are some final thoughts on TOCs, on aggregation, and if people were going to go away and start doing things differently from tomorrow, how can they start moving towards this round trip logic where they're really accounting for everything that is happening for that vehicle, fleet, etc.?
So the way that we've described TOCs and the relative freedom that we've had in terms of describing the TOC obviously is more applicable in the scenario in which you have primary data. In the case in which you have secondary data, you have a little bit less freedom in defining the transport operation category. So often you have to choose an emission intensity value, and remember, an emission intensity value is defined at the TOC or transport operation category level. You have to choose the one that most closely reflects the operations in question. And so what I always encourage people to do is cultivate a little bit of familiarity with, for example, the emission intensity values present in module 2 of the GLEC framework, and see the variety of ways in which TOCs are defined and the variety of emission intensity values that reflect those TOCs. And those TOCs can be very different depending on geography or mode of transport. And so I think that's really, really relevant. And if you're calculating emission intensity values based on primary data, I always encourage people to potentially look beyond the absolute individual trip level, because what I've also often noticed is that if you are defining the emission intensity value on an individual trip level, you find it difficult to account for empty running, and therefore you have to resort to an industry average empty running factor. And so by looking at a level of aggregations slightly higher, you can circumvent that problem and therefore not rely on industry averages.
So if I take two things from what you've just shared, firstly, we want to encourage people to cultivate familiarity with the emission intensity values shared in module 2 of the GLEC framework. And for those using primary data to calculate emission intensity values, look beyond individual trips to a slightly higher level of aggregation that's going to allow you to apply that round trip logic.
You've nailed it. Perfect.
I'm a quick study. Marcus, thank you. Do you have any closing thoughts on this just as we wrap up today's episode?
So sometimes with emission accounting, it's warranted to adopt a system view, meaning that we're buying into a system. So looking at an aggregation level that goes beyond the individual trip, an individual truck level is warranted, not just from an emission accounting logic, but also because when we're talking about decarbonizing, this is not something that we can do alone. So we also have to work with other actors along the same physical supply chain.
I think that's a really powerful point to end on. We can't do this alone. There are so many actors in the supply chain. There are so many actors that we are working with. And that's in addition to all of the work that we're all doing to account for our emissions accurately, bearing in mind that we have to collaborate with others in this process, is, I think, a super message to end today's episode on. Marcus, thank you so much for joining me, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.